This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everybody. We are going to attempt to present the content that we were going to cover on the March 25th EPPIC meeting that got canceled. We thought about doing this a couple different ways, and things kept falling through. So this is sort of our last ditch effort to try to get this message out there before things really start rolling in the fields. And the snowstorm of yesterday sort of bought us a little bit of time. So we said it's now or never. So I'm Jason Cavadini, and I have with me Matthew Omakin. Together, we are members of the advisory panel for EPPIC, which is the Old Plain Partnership for Integrated Conservation. I'm coming to you from Cavern Point Farm, and Matt is coming to you from his home at the Short Lane Ag Supply headquarters. So tonight we're going to talk about the future of agriculture in north central Wisconsin and what is sort of our vision of perhaps a new path forward, hence the name, which is what the name of our meeting on the 25th was going to be. So this is perhaps our vision of a new path forward for a battered industry and a bruised landscape. So the way we're going to approach this tonight is I'm going to narrate the presentation that I had prepared, and Matt's going to color commentate. So I guess you can think of it as I'm going to be Joel Buck and he's going to be Troy Aikman.
Oh, oh.
I knew that'd get a rise out of you, Matt.
Except I'm going to know what I'm talking about. That'll be the difference.
So along those lines, this is a totally unscripted uh, presentation, and so you're going to take the good with the bad. But this is not intended to be polished, but rather be a thought-provoking and conversation-starting um, presentation. So with that, let's jump into things. So this is a new path forward, and I'm going to try to move some things out of the way here on my screen so I can actually see what I'm presenting. So a
That
new
was a
path
very
forward.
professional disclaimer that you did there before.
What's that?
You had a very good disclaimer there. Okay, everybody, we're not meant to be polished on this presentation.
Right. Not polished at all. So we're talking about a new path forward. Really, when you boil it down, we're talking about breaking the cycle, and I'll get into that a little more with regenerative agriculture. So now, see if it's going to advance my slide. Here we go. So here is an overview of what agriculture looks like in north central Wisconsin. My slides are jumping around on me. So, we are very high density of dairy farms in our part of the state, continues to be even with the industry in turmoil over the last few years. And because of that, we have a lot of livestock. And because we're feeding a lot of livestock, we have a lot of corn silage and alfalfa ground. We have the most corn silage in the world, really, if you look at Clark and Marathon counties. And when you think about how this entire system kind of works together, you have a lot of land that has green living crops on it for a good portion of the year, and it's all harvested within a 2 to 3 week window. So you go from green living cover to absolutely no cover, and it's usually wet that time of year, so we're really pounding the soil. And then what do we do? But we plaster it with manure. That's sort of the traditional system. So we're not here to bash that. We're here to recognize why things are the way they are right now, and then to start identifying a new path forward that is maybe a better approach. Because I think one thing we'll discuss here is how it's pretty clear that things aren't working. And if you look at the bottom couple pictures here, whether it's the news story with the algae blooms in the water, or if you even look in the Green Bay in Wisconsin, we have our own, it's well documented, the hypoxic area in the Gulf coming out of the Mississippi. Well, we have our own version of that here in Wisconsin.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to ignore, especially that, did you know, Jason, that 92% of Wisconsinites get their water currently estimates are in the range of 8 to 10% of those wells are compromised, and they're in the conditions that are no better than a third world country. So it's not that we're here to tell farmers that this is all because of you. What we're trying to tell people here is that the way we've been doing things has been wrong, and we need, like you said in your title, new step forward. And that's all we're trying to do here is we're recognizing a problem and coming up with solutions.
And so before we dwell on the fact that things aren't really that things could be better, let's talk about why they are the way they are. I don't think we want to just um, flippantly say that everyone has been doing things wrong for a lot of years. We know more now than we did 10, 20 years ago. And I think it's important to understand that this whole thing is a cycle. This snapshot that we just discussed, it's hard to break out of that. And that's what we're talking about with this breaking out of the cycle. So we're farming degraded resources because we've done this for generations, and the soil is so degraded that we are really married to this system. If we are harvesting degraded soil in the fall and we rut it and then we put manure on it, the only way we can we think that we can fix it is by tilling it. And because we have no structure in the spring, we end up having to till it again, and it's just this perpetuating cycle. So really what we're going to talk about today is how to get out of that. But this is the result of that cycle, and this is a picture that you took, Matt. And this is a typical springtime picture with snow melt in our region.
And you can also notice here, like this is a fall till field. This acreage is so pulverized, and that just by simple operations of the chopper going through, basically rutted up this whole entire thing. From a business standpoint, and you got to be wondering to yourself, how the heck is that going to give me any kind of leg up on the new season when you have something looking?
Yeah, I think that picture there is like the epitome of starting the season on the wrong foot.
Ain't that the truth?
So how do we get away from that? Excuse me. So these are what I refer to as the stones in the foundation. So this is by no means an exhaustive list and how of regenerative agriculture, but these are what I sort of consider the low-hanging fruits in our region. So we have no-till planting. So that's a picture of us planting last spring, planting green. No tillage. We have annual cover crops. Taking that a step further, on the right, we have interseeded cover crops. So, you know, when we first started talking about cover crops in this region, it was a hard sell because we already have a pretty short window of a growing season, and now to try to get another crop in there was pretty overwhelming to think about. But interseeding is a game changer. Grazing, and we're not just talking about any grazing, managed grazing, integrating livestock back onto the land. And then the use of perennials, whether it's perennial forage crops or native species, taking some acres out of production in order to be more profitable. And really, all of these practices are encompassed in these few terms here: soil health, cover crops, and regenerative agriculture. So that's really going to be the premise of what we talk about. Um, so before we dig any deeper into this, I kind of want to define a couple of those terms. So soil health is, and there's a lot of definitions for soil health and for cover crops, and these are kind of compilations of a lot of those. Soil health is the condition of the soil and its potential to sustain biological functions, maintain environmental quality, and promote plant, animal, and human health.
AKA just being better than what it should be.
Right. Cover crops can be defined as a multifunctional crop that prevents erosion, improves soil physical and biological properties, supplies nutrients, suppresses weeds, improves water cycling, breaks pest cycles, and provides forage along with many other benefits.
The ACE card of crop systems.
See if I can get my slide to advance here.
Man, look at that. Is there anything that those cover crops can't do?
So if you take all of those last couple slides and package all of that into one term, we have regenerative agriculture. So this is a term that has really come onto the radar in the last couple of years and will continue to. And really what we're talking about is keeping continuous living roots, living plants in the soil. So let's talk about regenerative agriculture here for a minute, because I think that's a term that strikes up some sort of feeling or emotion in a lot of people, a lot of farmers. Is it a buzz term? Is it a fad? Is it a marketing scheme? Is it the 2020 version of some of these other terms like all natural or sustainable or conservation? um, I'm here to say that I think it's here to stay. Um, this graphic here is off of the General Mills website. So they define regenerative agriculture as possessing these 5 core principles: minimal soil disturbance, maximum crop diversity, continuous cover on the soil, maintaining living roots year round, and integrating livestock. So I think if we see companies like General Mills adopting this, it's definitely a wave coming for the future.
That's what you gotta try cereal companies, my friends. Is there a delay, or are you waiting for me to say more?
This is being very slow.
Okay.
I don't know why.
I like that first point there where the committed to 100% no-till and then almost feel guilty if they gotta level out some ground or they have to do any kind of workup. But the key concept is minimizing the disturbance.
So I think, when it comes to regenerative agriculture, you might be asking why. Why do we need a new term? Why do we need to keep changing things all the time? Why is conservation not good enough, or something, some of those other terms that we discussed? Well, if you go back to the mid 1930s, Aldo Leopold, who was the godfather of conservation, had an issue with conservation and what a lot of people called conservation back then already. And he basically said that we're basically talking about land doctoring versus the science of land health. And so, in a large part, regenerative agriculture acknowledges the fact that conservation is, or what we've always thought of it, may not be enough. It may not be holistically thinking enough.
I love that.
Boy, this is very slow.
Slower than a Minnesota Vikings season, am I right?
This meeting is being recorded.
So when we talk about how regenerative agriculture sort of takes what we've always thought of conservation a step further, I really like how this book that I've been reading, written by a guy from Australia, I like how he describes it. Now, this first quote could be offensive when you first hear it, especially if you're someone who's worked with the land for a lot of years, but just listen to it with an open mind. Those who live close to the earth, we farmers, have become as illiterate as anyone else when it comes to reading our landscapes. And then he says regenerative agriculture implies more than just sustaining something, but rather an active rebuilding or regeneration of existing systems towards full health. So I understand that there's a lot of people out there who are, um, you know, second, third, or more generation managing the same piece of land, and they have poured a lot into that land, and they have always felt that they have treated it the best they possibly can, and I don't doubt that at all. But I think when you look at that second quote, it is hard to argue with the fact that if there is a way that is beyond sustaining, if there's a way to manage our land in a way that will rebuild it and regenerate it past its full health, then that's a good idea. And it's possible, it's conceivable to think that none of us know the full potential of our land because we've all been managing degraded land for generations.
Well, exactly right. And, when you're using the word illiterate, we should take offense to that because just think about how, even being in grade school or even all the way into high school, where nobody has any understanding or awareness of all what goes on down below for like soil biology. There's no classes on soil types. Like I had to wait until well after college to even realize that Wisconsin has multitudes of different soil zones. And I think that there's this pressure, especially in the farming community, that people want to try to branch out more, and they look at their fields, and sometimes when you're in a system bad like that, sometimes you get stuck in a rut and you just keep hitting repeat. There, rut.
Yep.
You mixing another drink over there, or what are you doing?
No, I'm good. Okay, so why why regenerative agriculture? To achieve soil health. So we talk about how this term kind of packages all those together. So we want to achieve soil health, want to have profitable farms, to protect our resources, to have healthy people. So this goes beyond the farm, and to have healthy communities. Because if the communities aren't healthy, if people aren't healthy, the support system for agriculture goes away. So soil health is a component of regenerative agriculture.
Yeah, ditto.
So I like to talk about regenerative agriculture as a ladder. And this is something that I finally came up with this year because I had been struggling the last few years with how really to talk about this because of all the times that I get asked to speak about conservation practices, it seems that I'm always talking about the same things and it seems like we're not going very deep. And you'll also see in a few slides when I start to show some data that I really believe the data are telling us that as we implement these practices onto the land, that potential, like I talked about a few slides earlier, is greater than what we'll ever know. So regenerative agriculture is a ladder, and across that gradient is soil health. So as we go up the ladder, soil health improves. No-till planting, the practice that I've talked about for years now that I continue to get asked to talk about, I view as the first rung on the ladder. It is the first step into a regenerative system, and we must go much further than that to have a truly regenerative system. Continuous living cover crops takes us further up. Perennial crops, managed grazing, really where we're trying to get is the holy grail, which is fully functioning soil and biology and crops without off-farm inputs.
There's some people that are even taking a reverse, where that first rung actually could even be cover crops. You know what I mean? Having an approach where they can have protective cover in one of your worser scenarios, which is, and also into fall. which I find very interesting.
Yep. And so what I'll show in a few slides is by stopping tillage, we move the needle a little bit, but continuous cover is even more important than eliminating tillage.
Hmm.
So that cycle that we talked about earlier, how do we get out of that? Whether we call it the cycle of degradation or the cycle of unprofitability, how do we break out of that cycle? And really, why is it important to figure that out? It's because we cannot begin to move towards soil health until we break out of that cycle. As long as we are in that self-perpetuating cycle, we are not going to be able to obtain soil health.
Now, in this cycle, does that mean you got to totally remove yourself from every facet of that cycle, or is it?
No, but but as long as you continue to keep every one of those links in place, it's like you have to figure out which link you're gonna break, and then you start on that pathway. And then I think the natural progression is once you start on that pathway, you start to look critically at all those other links, and you start to come up with a strategic process for minimizing them or eliminating them. And it ends up different for everybody, depending on their management and their land and all those other things. But I think the big thing is figuring out how to exit that. And that's why it's so important to spend time with farmers who have done it.
Which one of those do you think is the first thing that people want to break away from? Like, what's the first link that they want to break the chain on? I know we're spending time on this slide, but I think that's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought that the easiest is no-till planting.
So damaged fields or tillage?
Eliminating tillage. And the reason I say that is because, and you and I have both experienced this, but as we work with farmers and interact with farmers who started no-tilling, they'll be blown away by how firm their fields get and how much they can hold up traffic in just the first year. And all they did was no-till planted. No-till planting failed back in the 80s in our area, but we have equipment that they didn't have back then. And we also have support groups now, which may sound funny, but it's a huge deal. You have farmers who are interested in no-tilling, but they have no idea how to start it. And they'll talk to someone who's been doing it for 9 years. And now you have a farmer who's a rookie no-tiller who has a really good idea of how to start and be successful without ever having done it before, just because he's rubbed elbows with someone who is doing it or has been doing it. So I think that's really important.
Mm-hmm.
So we talk about anecdotal evidence a lot, and I guess that last conversation was a good segue into this. So when we bring farmers on to the station or anywhere else that we host a field walk or a pasture walk, really what we're doing is sharing anecdotal evidence, which is a fancy word for clues. Clues that farmers have picked up by doing things different on their own farms. And the big one that we just discussed is as farmers move toward no-till, they'll say, well, I can get out earlier in the spring without damaging fields, and I can harvest in the fall and I'm not putting ruts in the field. And we hear that stuff all the time. And so what our goal was to start to collect data that would support what the farmers are saying they're seeing on their own farms. So we set up this trial in spring of 2014, basically to answer the question, what happens to the soil when you break out of the cycle? That's basically what we're looking at. So this isn't real important, but this map here, but if you look, we took this field that was a hay field and put it into a corn and soybean rotation in spring of 14. And we tested a few different systems: conventional tillage against no-till with and without cover crops. So what did we learn? Basically, we look at, I'm going to present this in like two different phases. So from 2014 to 2017, we saw and we measured with these various measurements here, the soil got firmer, but did not slow water infiltration. It became better structured and more stable and never inhibited yield. So how did we measure that? So here we have a, can you see my mouse moving on your screen,
Yeah, you're
Matt?
pointing at that kid with the pentrometer thingy.
Yeah. So there's a penetrometer. We're measuring the basically the firmness of the soil down through the profile. And here we're measuring infiltration, your soil structure. So we measured all those. And here's just a couple of the graphics. So here there's just two lines on each graph comparing the blue is conventional tillage. Oh, I see I used the wrong data on there. Oh man, well we'll still look at it anyway. So we have conventional tillage with a cover crop and no-till without a cover crop. That can't be right. My data's wrong.
Oh, hey, and we got this on record, everybody.
Yep.
What he says.
This meeting is being recorded.
All right, we're back. We did a little doctoring to the slides and they're still not perfect, but I'll try to explain this here. So, how did we figure all these changes in the first phase of the study? So, we took penetration resistance with the soil penetrometer every other year. And so I'm just showing the 2018 data here, but every year that we measured it, the difference got greater. So if you look at the blue line, as we move down through the soil profile, look in the top 6 to 8 inches. It is much firmer on the soil surface than the continuous conventional tillage with no cover crop. So you have conventional and no-till with cover crop, and there's a big difference in firmness. Now, is that considered compaction? Well, we know it's not because of what we see in the infiltration measurement. So I apologize that because I had to do my slide doctoring, now the formatting is not the same. So the orange is conventional tillage without cover crop, and the gray is no-till with cover crop. And I guess it really doesn't matter because there's no difference if you run the stats on this. And we have done this test 3 different times, and frustratingly, every time we never got a difference. But then we take a break and we say, okay, we were hoping that we would see improved infiltration, but the fact that we see the soil getting firmer and we're not seeing the no-till treatment have lower infiltration tells us that this firm soil is not compaction because it's still taking in water.
It's stable soil.
It is.
Am I back or am I still old?
Nope, you're still mole.
Duh. Well, hi everybody. I'm just a screen now.
So, but a lot of people, when we talk about regenerating our landscape, will say that the biggest issue we have across the landscape in much of the United States is a water cycling problem. And I would say that's definitely the case here. So a lot of why we farm the way we farm is to manage poorly drained soils. And we believe that tilling and breaking up the soil is what we need to do. But as we've mentioned, that keeps us in that perpetuating cycle. And as this data show us that as we stop tilling and let that soil become stable and well structured, it'll become firmer and hold us up, but it'll still take in water, which is what we need it to do.
See, and that goes back to that one quotation you had from Call the Reed Warbler, where that gentleman said farmers are have become illiterate of reading the landscape. Because when you think about the concept of what tillage is supposed to be doing, we're basically artificially stimulating bioturbation in the ground. We're trying to force the infiltration, the aeration. We're trying to break up the structure of the ground because we deemed it inefficient of it doing it on its own. You know what I mean? And that's just an example of that because nobody knew any better. Growing up on the dairy farm, that was just common. Like dad knew better than to mow, bore, plow, but he's like, you got to till because you got to aerate the soil and you got to create pore space. And it wasn't until, once you start really digging into this stuff, literally, you realize that the ground could do it for you and it could do it for free if you just give it time.
Right. So so the focus on soil health has been really good because a lot of people learn stuff about soil that has always existed, but we just didn't really realize it, and it never was taught in the context of crop management. And I think that
It's
has
all
been
about
one of the
production.
issues. Right.
My
So,
bad. I see a screen.
you're still a screen. We'll let you know when we see you again, but we're getting by just fine.
That's fine.
So the other part of that 2014 to 2017 phase is stability. So we got firmer, we took in water, but we got more stable. So here's aggregate stability, basically a measure of the naturally occurring aggregates or clods of soil. If you take a shovelful and break it apart, not forcefully, but just let it crumble, what kind of structure do we have? And this isn't really telling us that, but it's telling us how stable those aggregates are. And I guess the most important thing is to look at the no-till and cover crop bar is the highest or the most stable. This is looking at the diameter of those naturally occurring aggregates. And the most interesting thing is if you look at an undisturbed field edge, so this would be like the gold standard. It hasn't been disturbed, hasn't had inputs, it's had continuous living cover. We are approaching that by having continuous cover crop and by not disturbing the soil. And even what's really interesting about that is when you stop tilling, you move in that direction, but you don't get as far as you can by also integrating in continuous cover.
I find that
So
interesting.
basically,
Sorry. I was gonna say I find it really interesting, and I never would have realized this with your weight and diameter. Tillage no cover versus tillage with cover. You think that a cover crop system would help out in a little bit, but according to your data here, that with tillage no cover versus tillage with cover.
yep.
And that was my interesting commentary of that slide.
That's true, and that's why it needs to be a systems approach, and there's no silver bullet when it comes to regenerative agriculture.
Yup.
So basically, the take home here is eliminating tillage was the step onto the first rung of the ladder, but there's more to the story. So that was the 2014 to 2017. So then we look at the last 2 years. That's when things really started getting interesting. And some of these we weren't even anticipating. So we got better at getting the cover crops in because of interseeding. So those last 2 years, 2018 and 2019, we got really good cover crops finally. So I guess one disclaimer is for that first phase, although we saw differences from the no-till and cover crops, we had 1 year where we really hit it out of the park with awesome. It was a triticale cover crop, and we planted green the next year. The other years was always a little bit of a struggle, depending on whether we were planting after soybeans or corn silage, but we were always trying to get a small grain in after one of those, and that's just pushing it.
Mm-hmm.
And so interseeding was the game changer for us, and so we were able to get a good green cover. And that's when so the first thing was we never inhibited crop yield. So having that nice green crop in between corn rows never affected corn yield positively or negatively. It just stayed the same as if there was nothing there. But even more interesting, and this is what we didn't anticipate, it caused better forage quality. So we grew corn silage 2 years in a row just because the first year we saw this, we wanted to verify it again. Now this next year we're going to actually plant Italian rye so we can harvest it as a forage and continue to see if we see forage quality differences. But we saw better digestibility. In fact, I think my next slide, and Matt, if you have anything to add while I get the next slide up.
So this is the interseeding that's the interseeding that we did this year.
Yep.
Yeah,
on
that
last
was,
picture.
yeah, I always love those because you can just see how vibrant green all those pictures are. Because even on our place where we had really great interseeding, well, there was great interseeding all around last year, but where we did early interseeding and it really took off, that corn stayed vibrant green ever since the moment that cover crop went on there. Whereas other fields where there was no cover, they immediately got nitrogen deficient, they got pale, they got yellow, you had lesions, all that kind of stuff. And those are and those subtle differences make the biggest impact, because then all of a sudden that opens up to the realm of, fertility management, fungicide applications even, you know what I mean? So, and just doing something simple as just planting coverage crops in between can just do such great impacts in a positive way.
Yeah, and furthermore, it sort of changes our philosophy of how we look at weeds. Not to totally dismiss the importance of weed control. We understand that competition is an important thing to consider, but if we can grow a thick mat of cover crops in between corn rows and not see a yield penalty, then maybe we shouldn't worry quite as much about weeds as what we've been led to believe in the past. Um, so just to go a little further into that, so the presence of cover crops didn't inhibit yield, but caused better forage quality. So here's the corn silage yields for 14, 16, 18, and 19 for each treatment. And I can tell you that you don't have to look at it very long because there was never a difference. So compare all the light colored bars. There's, minor differences there. You can maybe pick up on some trends, but none of them are statistical. So we've never seen, we were always excited about this because we said, well, we can transition to no-till and not expect any different of a yield, which a lot of people historically said. But now we're seeing that as we transition to no-till and cover crops, we see better forage quality, and these look like maybe minor differences here between treatments, but they are statistical. So the no-till treatments have better digestibility, which if you follow that all the way through with yield, we have more melt per acre where we have cover crops and no-till.
And this isn't, you weren't doing this with like a like a leafy variety, a TMF, BMR, nothing like that, right?
No, this was a multi-purpose hybrid because we're um, measuring grain and silage yield out of these plots. So, but basically the take home here is soil health improves by eliminating tillage, but cover crops move us further up the ladder.
Now, one thing I want people to really look at is, the startling differences in the quality on the right hand side, but take a look at the left hand side and really make a good honest look at that, where it says corn silage yields by management system. There is no drastic difference from any given year. So when somebody comes up to you and says, you just wait till it's cold and wet, or you just wait till it's getting really beastly hot, it doesn't matter. This is from multiple years. The yield marks are, and Jason, you can correct me if I'm wrong, statistically, they're exactly the same.
Right.
So when somebody says, you know what they say, no till, no crop, you can say, shove that in your whatever, because it doesn't make any sense.
So the moral of the story is soil health is affected by physical disturbance like tillage, but the process is driven by biology. And so then it must be a systems approach. And I know that's something that Matt, you harp on often.
Which one? The biology?
Systems approach.
Yes, because it's all about the landscape management. And I can't take credit for that term because I learned that from Jason, but no, it's absolutely right. And there's lots of farms that have been doing that for decades. You know, I was even thinking about that when today, when I was walking around and I was walking past the old remnants of our heifer barn, and I remember hauling manure out. And I remember that dad specifically staged, and then maybe I'm skipping ahead, but dad would specifically stage certain rotations to help allocate not only manure applications, but just to diversify his hay and corn silage. He would incorporate small grains for the sake of just having not just a straw and grain, but having a different crop out there. You know, so he was doing landscape management before anybody even knew what it was.
Right. And that's where you start to get into this whole new path forward conversation and how we start to implement this. So all this information is good. Well, how does it change what we're doing?
Right.
So in that last slide, then I mentioned that, we focus a lot on the physical disturbance, but we have to understand that it's bigger than that. It's a biologically driven process, which almost everything in the soil is. So when we talk about soil biology, really what we're talking about is symbiotic relationships in the soil. So there's a lot of examples of that. Here we have the carbon cycle here. We have plants that are basically pumping carbon into the soil, which are enriching the soil and giving it all of the nutrients that it needs to make these symbiotic relationships function, which actually benefit plants and build the soil. So, and probably the most well-known example of that is mycorrhizal fungi, which here's a picture of the hyphae, which these are microscopic. Here's a fibrous root, one of the very small roots that we normally don't even see because when we uproot a plant, they stay in the soil. And the hyphae are attacking those on a corn plant. And basically, they're attacking it, but they're not doing anything to it except helping it take up phosphorus. But they're also getting what they need out of the corn plant. And then in the process, they exude this compound called glomalin, which is essentially the glue that holds the soil together. So we have this entire process going on all the time. We have to understand that when we do things like tillage, we're disrupting the process and it needs to start over again.
Man, you had a better term for all this, man. I remember the glomalins weren't just. There was another term.
You talking about the snot?
You can work, and then what did you say with that dip?
It's possible to till the snot out of the soil.
If I can harp one more thing, like relationships, essentially what you want to do is you want to capture the efficiency that's happening in nature on its own without any kind of input, meaning every rut, every fungi is releasing different chemical signals at any given time, which is accessing new nutrients for ruts. It's also driving pathogens out, and it's creating water stability and infiltration and what have you. So all these things, when you just leave it go and let it do its thing, you create this reservoir of efficiency in your acreage. And and then like what Jason was just said there, when you go or field finisher, disc, chisel plow, especially moldboard plow, you keep hitting the reset button, and they got to start that work all over again.
Yep. And so when we talk about how to avoid disrupting that cycle, that's where we talk about interseeding of cover crops and annual cropping systems as being a game changer. And really, in my opinion, that practice is essential in our region. And I feel that that is where we need to um, expend the most of our energy right now to perfect the practice of interseeding in annual crop systems. Now, a perennial pasture still may be the gold standard. And really, what we're doing with interseeding is trying to get our row crop acres as close to a perennial system as we can. So we want to get green crops that overlap each other. We don't want a lag time between those crops. When we talk about interseeding, we're talking about a method of establishing a crop into an already established crop. Basically, overlapping succeeding crops by keeping the solar panels on the land as often as possible. Those solar panels that are taking sunlight and converting it into carbon that they're pumping into the soil.
You can see that a lot of these cover crops are specifically designed to be in an environment of an interseeding, especially in like a 30-inch row corn system here. Because you can see like that big broadleaf plant there, that's a cowpea. That's designed to not just be drought tolerant, but also shade tolerant. So that's like what Jason was saying. I think that is like the biggest step and the biggest thing to get to is the interseeding part of it, is because you get way more coverage on the ground. Because imagine all the weeds that's suppressing. Imagine all the accessing of nutrients and water and everything else that those plants are doing. But there's definitely a plethora of different coverage crops that you can get that are shade tolerant, drought tolerant, and designed to go through wet spells too. But I digress.
Right.
This meeting is being recorded.
All right, we're back on. We had to take a little break there.
Yeah, snack break. Cheese sticks, anyone? Jason, do you want one?
Sure.
Okay.
Support the dairy farmers, everybody.
That's right. Eat more cheese, drink more milk.
So Matt last mentioned the diversity of the cover crops, and that's where it's really important to understand the variation of roles between the different species, and to try to get a variation of roles in your cover crop, and that's where a diverse cover crop can really be strong. And so here's a mix that we used last year that Matt can maybe say a little more about that we came up with, but it's pretty important for us to keep the cost and within a acceptable range. So we were at about $27 an acre for seed, and we figured about $14 an acre for planting. So we're at roughly $40 an acre for planting the cover crop. We are doing it, if you look in the bottom right hand picture, we're doing it at the same time that we are side dressing nitrogen. So it's really it's not an extra not an extra pass in the operation. So you can maybe discount a little bit of the planting cost there. But in October we had now this is wet on a wet basis, but we had about 3.5 tons of biomass out there. But keep in mind that that's about 86% moisture, which if you um, translate that to a dry matter basis, it's about a half ton per acre. It's not really significant unless you're going to use it as a forage or graze it. But if you look at that picture there, that's protecting the soil, and it is adding carbon to the soil.
And that's a heck of a lot more poundage than most people would say, not to name names, but most people would say that was even possible of doing.
In our region especially. So.
And I'd like to say that, yeah, 20 pounds to the acre may seem a low range, but the more work that we're getting into, especially when we're figuring out timing, especially, we might one person might even say that that's getting to be a heavy application where some of those can actually be reduced even further. So seeding costs can actually get way, way less. So I can't do an interseeding because I can't afford 40 or 50. That's just not true. There's a lot of interseeding mixes that we did last year and that we're quoting out this year where they're anywhere in the range from $16, $17 an acre. And somebody who is looking for like a lot of biomass, let's say they're going to do some grazing and they want to throw a huge cocktail out there, then yeah, you will be up in that $26 to $30 range, but you're getting a lot of benefit out of that to begin with. But yeah, Jason went with heavy grass, and yeah, he basically had a really good mix on there. I was really impressed with the cowpeas of anything in that mix. That was rape especially, but I really like the cowpeas in that mix.
And I'm a big proponent of the annual ryegrass as kind of the foundation of the mix because it fills in everything. So a lot of these things we're talking about low rates. So the clover, that's actually a pretty good rate for clover. It's a lot of seeds, but these other brassicas, the kale and the rape, that those are low rates of all those. So if you just planted those alone, you wouldn't have um, it wouldn't be very dense. But you're adding those to the mix not for the thick cover, but for their variation of rolls. But really, you're letting the annual ryegrass kind of do the majority of the work, creating a mat. So, and the reason we stick with that is because of all those crops, annual ryegrass and clover are the two that are consistent across the biggest variation of conditions.
Yeah, and it's the easiest seed to get to. And generally speaking, with the exception of dwarf Essex rape, it's one of your lower cost inputs for interseeding is that clover, and especially that annual ryegrass.
And by the way, Matt, at some point along the way, we started being able to see you again. So
I'm back, people. I'm back.
we're at 52 minutes of recording, so we're gonna keep moving here. So this is more of what we mentioned earlier, but we have data from 2018 and 2019. On the left here, this is corn grain yields with a variation of different. Now these were not diverse mixes of interseeding, but we had no significant difference. Even though it looks like the red clover and the annual ryegrass and clover did better yield wise. This is from a replicated, randomized trial. No statistical difference. So basically, the cover crops were not a weed, as some people would say, and did not do anything to hurt yield. 2018, here we have corn silage. So if you look at this is from the study we've been talking about. If you look at the sets of bars that have the white dots in them, those are the two that had the cover crops. We had no difference where there was interseeded cover crop, but interestingly, you see the same trend again. So even though the stats tell us there's no difference, numerically, the trend shows that where there's a cover crop, the yield is slightly better, which is very interesting.
Interesting indeed.
And this is corn grain. This is not silage here. So obviously this year our yields were very depressed because of the type of year we had in the late planting. So we're going to just talk about a couple other things as we start to think more about how to get these regenerative practices on the land and how to create a new path forward for agriculture. So perennials play a significantly important role, especially where there's livestock. There's no reason why we shouldn't be considering perennials more. So here we're talking about perennial pasture scenarios, we know from years of work that it's important to have legumes in a grass stand to feed nitrogen to that stand. It is not, when you have legumes in a stand, Jeff Brink had worked with USDA Dairy Forage that showed it's not economical to put fertilizer on a pasture as long as you have legumes on it. It's only economical when there are no legumes in the stand. So it's a good practice to try to keep legumes or clover in the pasture. So we did this trial last year looking at different methods of interseeding clover into a pasture. So we did 5 pounds per acre over these 4 different treatments. Tine weeder seeder, which is this here. It's basically pulling spring teeth like from a rake across the ground and just kind of moving that thatch out of the way, scratching it up a little bit and blowing seed on. A month before that, we did frost seeding. And obviously we had a treatment with no interseeding. And then the same day as this, we did a no-till drill. At best, only 30% of the seeds became established. So here we had frost seeding, which did better than the rest of them, plants per square foot. But we still did less than 9 plants per square foot when we started out with 32 seeds per square foot. So we just know that by putting a seed into a highly competitive environment that we're asking a lot of it. But it seems that frost seeding gave us our best chance of it working out.
Now, would you say that frost seeding is always a great approach?
It really does vary by the year. So it varies a lot by the year. It varies by the pasture, but I would say, but especially after seeing this and now this year frost seeding work again this year, I'm starting to see the reason why I think frost seeding is going to work better than the other methods more often than not is because of the competition factor. We're getting it out there a month earlier. We're getting it out there before things green up. So we're giving that seed much more of a chance to get established before it's getting out competed.
Mm-hmm.
So then we measured the grass where there was and wasn't clover, and we found that where there was clover, we had 38% more nitrogen in the grass, 37% higher protein, and 35% higher relative forage quality. So this really shows how important it is to try to keep clovers out there, and it can be as simple as broadcasting seed when there's still snow on the ground. And really, I mean, Matt, you sell seed, and you know you've got a variation. You know you have highly affordable seed, and you have very highly proven seed that comes at a cost. And I guess what my point is when it comes to something like frost seeding or broadcasting cover crops, even at some of the rates we're talking, it's not. It is a fairly economical thing, especially with pastures.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and even that's what I was going to ask you is like with frost seeding, is it a lot to do with not just the kind of winter that we were having?
Yeah,
Just know when to frost seed at certain times.
I don't. To be honest, I've done. I've sort of been on a roller coaster with frost seeding. I failed at it a few times, and I started thinking that it really doesn't work here. And then we started pulling the no-till drill around more, and then I started realizing, and I was pretty excited about that, and I realized how low the success rate of that even can be at times. And then when we started getting better at interseeding cover crops, I started getting better at frost seeding, and they're related because you're trying to establish a plant in an atmosphere where there's already established plants in both scenarios. And so when you start learning how to manipulate competition, you get better at both of them.
Mhm.
And I think so, the no-till drill made us think that we can solve all of our problems with the right equipment. And I think often we're kind of geared as farmers, we're sort of geared to think that way. Like, engineer, how can we engineer out whatever our challenge is? And it's really not an engineering thing at all. It's a timing thing, and it's an understanding, almost understanding physiology and understanding competition and stuff like that. So like the time that we're frost seeding a lot of these pastures, say it's a meadow fescue pasture, we're doing it 2 months before it's gonna be 6 inches tall.
Mhm.
So we're given that seed a full 2 months to establish.
Right.
So then continuing on with interseeding, last year we had a lot of winter killed alfalfa, so we went across a lot of acres with the no-till drill. Now this, and I will say, so I just got done talking about the success rate of the no-till drill. There's certain crops that it's tough to get to establish without drilling them into the ground. Grasses are one of them. We covered a lot of those acres instead of starting over and planting alfalfa new and tearing these fields out and transitioning other fields. We interseeded Italian rye into those fields at 10 pounds per acre, which costs about $40 an acre. The interesting thing is you look at the cutting intervals here, it's not at all what you would be used to in a dairy operation. We really got stretched out because of the rain, but we had some pretty respectable yields and, comparing it to alfalfa and look at the quality here. So our proteins maybe won't excite people who are used to working with high quality alfalfa cut at 26 to 28 days, but look at the RFQs here in the milk. This is a crop that I really think we should be planting more of in our region and taking advantage of rather than demanding so much out of alfalfa.
Yeah, and that's the one thing is that I had a farmer just tell me that this morning, where he's like, my alfalfa's coming up, but it's kind of lagging behind. Where he's like, this is the third year in a row where I've seen my grass roar ahead of everything else. And then I look at your statistic there, like, so at $40 an acre, somebody would say like, oh, geez, for Italian rye, and it's only going to be there for like a season, like a lot. Well, when you think about a low rate of alfalfa in a mix, you're spending about the same amount of dollars just on the alfalfa alone. And then if you have that stuff only half come back the next year, or even you lose a third, or let's say that it all just kind of peters out after a really harsh winter in 2 years, you're right back to square one. So to me, when you see data like this and you see results from this, something with Italian rye, it makes it a really compelling and clear choice that this is like what Jason said. This is a crop that needs to be in more systems, more frequently used, and but already is.
Yep.
Uh-huh.
So, and then this is to sort of take that a step further. So, here's a field here that we interseeded, winter killed alfalfa, so that you can see the square here. Was an area that we avoided, just to be able to compare where we interseeded and where we didn't, and then we left some fields like that as well. So here's one field here that we interseeded that was winter killed, and we had about 3.75 tons of dry matter off of that field. And the one that we didn't touch and we just left the way it was, we were just over a ton and a half. So for $40 an acre, we significantly increased our dry matter yield off of that field, as opposed to the alternative of $150 an acre to replant alfalfa. And so it resulted in 130% more forage. And if you back calculate that, that extra forage came at a cost of about $19 a ton. And I don't think you would have been able to find any feed for $19 a ton last growing season.
No doubt.
To begin to kind of wrap this up here, as we talk about moving forward, and identifying how to do things better. Really, in order to have a regenerative mindset, we need to start thinking holistically. We need to be a holistic manager. We're not just managing the farm or just the land. It's a holistic approach. That involves off the farm as well, and that's something that we're pretty focused on in our watershed group. Beyond just the farm, we need to prioritize soil health, manage ecology. We're harvesting sunlight, manage the underground herd, so the biology below ground. Keep biology in mind with each decision we make and start to understand the consequences of everything that we do, whether it's tillage, not that it's criminal to pull out a tillage tool to fix something or something like that. We understand that stuff happens, but it's just really good to know the consequences of those practices. And then really just remember that we're nurturing symbiotic relationships.
Yeah. That's everything basically in a nutshell. And when you think about it, that's not really too hard to ask for and that's in any kind of sized farming. What am I trying to say? Any size farm, small, medium, or large. I don't think that's a lot to ask for when you think about that, because when you think about it, when you want to, as a business person, maximize your effort, it's all about working smarter, not harder. And by working with nature instead of against it, you're streamlining your whole operation. You know what I mean? And you're just making it so much easier for you. I don't know how else to say it, but it seems so simple, but yet it's so complex at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing, sort of what you're saying, is for a long time, practices like this we've treated as almost like a sacrifice. Like you need to buy into it and then just trust the process and trust that it's going to benefit you. But I think what we're starting to see and maybe getting better at demonstrating is that it's not as big of a trade off as what people thought. In fact, it's not a trade off at all. And I think we're almost getting to the point where um, it's it's like gonna become accepted that it's a good idea to farm this way because it benefits you and your land, and then everything else as well.
Yeah, because
A trade off or a sacrifice.
because the days of being like, I gotta have top yield. It's how to maximize your margin per acre, not maximize your yield per acre. You know what I mean? And the other thing I wanted to say was a lot of these are coming arise, like this renaissance is happening around us because there used to be the mindset of it's inevitable that the ground that we have is too cold or wet or what have you, whatever excuse came up, and that runoff is going to happen, and sediment loss is going to happen, and that's why we have to build a tolerance, just because it's inevitable. But what we're starting to see in these last 3 years, especially, and especially this year, when we saw how well the ground can soak up the water, when we have very low disturbance on the surface and there's no sediment getting washed into these water systems, that's starting to change a little bit for guys, that we don't have to view sediment runoff as inevitable. So,
Yep. So then, how can we have a regenerative mindset? This is kind of where we put the rubber to the road. Till the soil only when absolutely necessary. Implement perennials as much as possible. Integrate continuous living cover crops into row crop systems. Use manure as a nutrient source as much as possible. And I know that that could open a whole hour-long conversation that we probably won't dive into, Matt. But
why?
um, integrate livestock onto the land and scrutinize every off-farm input.
That is a huge one. You would not believe how often our offices are bombarded with, you cannot believe the latest and greatest in biologicals. Biologicals is the wave of the future, but at the same time, um, every farmer should really weigh in and really research in any kind of input that you're putting towards your farm system, because there's a lot of stuff out there that it's just not going to work and it's going to be adversive. And people learned that the hard way with anhydrous of like about a half a decade ago or even a decade ago, when people loved what their corn yields were doing with anhydrous, but then they realized that after about 3 seasons, their fields turned to brick. And there's even down in Georgia, they had to buy earthworm eggs and they had to plant them back into the ground after they stopped using anhydrous. But that's where that comes from. And at the retail side, there's a lot of products that will boast a big game, but they won't benefit what your farm system is doing. But that's what something that I personally do, and my older brother and my dad, we all do, is what works for a farm system. But yeah, scrutinizing every farm, off farm input, I would agree with that one.
Yeah, and I think the question is this thing that I'm going to buy, am I able to achieve the same goal by just adopting some kind of practice on my farm? Because then that means that that's a practice that I should adopt, and then I don't have to buy it as well. So,
That's a really good point, because there's a big can of worms right there. And like seed treatment, for instance, or some biologicals that break down residue faster on your corn stalks, and you can spend $15-18 an acre to spray something that will chew up your corn stalks for you. But really, if you did landscape management with rotations, cover cropping, and minimum disturbance, you don't have to do like a band-aid like that. You know what I mean?
yep. So that brings us to the end, and this is the moment where Matthew Omican gives his big parting nugget of wisdom.
I do?
Yeah, I'm putting you on the spot
About what?
about how we're going, how agriculture is going to look moving forward.
Oh, you want me to do my Renaissance thing?
Sure.
I don't know what to say. I think I'm going to repeat myself, but I could try a little bit. Just looking through of what all has been going on, it's agriculture is kind of like in a renaissance right now, where it's not so much we are all pointing the finger and saying, farmers, this is all your fault. It's more of, we're just all realizing that stuff that we thought what was right actually has come to a choke point, and we realize that it's wrong. Marathon County, over 60% of the county's landmass is agricultural use. And 7.1% of the private wells in Marathon County are compromised due to excessive nitrate contamination. And what I'm trying to say is that a farmer shouldn't be reading that saying, well, that's because of the municipalities, that's because of over fertilized lawns. Somebody should be looking at saying, well, how can we make that better? And that is what this whole regenerative ag is doing too. This is more than just some kind of big fuzzy feeling push. This is more of like an entire top to bottom business platform revamp where we're hitting the reset button as an industry and we're looking at all the things that are happening around us and saying, how can we prevent it and how can we make our industry better? And of course, you're going to get resistance to that because people gave resistance when they invented the airplane, even. One of the greatest technologies that mankind ever came up with, and there was great resistance to it. But the way I see that, what I'm trying to say is that with regenerative ag, you'll have resistance to it. But I'm starting to feel that at the retail side, that voice is small. And the voice that's the loudest are people that are wanting to learn more. Because at the end of the day, farmers are just that. They are good hearted people. They care about the landscape, they care about their communities, and they worry about others and their well being. And that's why I call this a renaissance about this regenerative ag. And that's the future of farming going forward. Is that what you wanted to hear?
Yeah, so I guess, do we have the answers? No, clearly we do not have the answers. But I think we're beginning we're beginning the process. We're continuing a conversation about where identifying the areas that can be fine-tuned, and they're plentiful. I think in 5 to 10 years, agriculture in our area is going to look a lot different than it does now.
Mhm.
I hope and I am hopeful that it will continue to be dairy country, but I think dairy farming is going to look different than it is now. I hope we still have the livestock here because they're critical to agriculture, and I think it's important for us to help the general public understand the importance of livestock on the land. Um, but I think we need to do our part by starting to acknowledge where our shortcomings are, and to start showing a willingness to do things different, which I think most people are. But I think now is the time to start climbing that ladder, and to really start seeing the land improve. And so I think we're ending this without giving any solid answers, but maybe with a proclamation of hope that there's that I think a lot of us who have been working this for a few years now are starting to feel like we're making some progress. And so I think we have some momentum and we want to keep things heading in the right direction. And that's where groups like this watershed group are critical.
Yeah, and that was the main goal of us doing this present that we wanted to have this presentation before we any of us knew that we would be getting into a social distancing kind of scenario. This is I feel like this is the watershed moment, and that more and more people want to have this conversation keep going, and that's why we really felt that it was our duty to have that information presented, because it's all worthwhile, because especially when you see how farming is connected to a rural community and rural community is slowly withering away, agriculture is pivotal, and we have to do all that we can to find ways to keep it perpetuating, but to do it in a regenerative format, I think. And I agree with Jason, like 5 to 10 years, it might even be sooner than that. The landscape will be completely different. Farming practices are going to be different. And that's nothing new, though.
So I think we've had everyone's attention, or probably not their attention, long enough. So I guess that is all we had. But I think it's a good start, and we're maybe just a couple weeks from all of a sudden everyone being out in the field and things will be rolling. So if you're a farmer, we thank you for taking the time to listen to us. If you're a non-farmer, we are extremely grateful that you took the time to listen to us. And just for the farmers, stay strong, um, hold on to hope. And for all the non-farmers out there, just do what you can to infuse a little hope into the farmers and encourage them. But otherwise, we just thank you all for listening, and we will see you next time. Bye. Stop recording.